Hello and welcome. In the next 5 minutes we are going to master brainstem neuroanatomy. Although admittedly this might be just a little bit of hyperbole, as it may take us slightly more than 5 minutes in a couple of parts. And I'm not sure we'll actually master brainstem neuroanatomy. But in part one we will learn the location of the cranial nerve nuclei in the brainstem. And in part two, the location of the major longitudinal tracts. So between the location of the nuclei and the course of the major tracts, it won't give us quite mastery, but it'll give us a pretty good head start on brainstem neuroanatomy. I'm going to start with a little bit of a digression that has nothing to do with the brainstem, in that our conversation is going to focus on cranial nerves 3 through 12, the ones that have brainstem nuclei. And we'll skip the first two. I'll cover a little bit about the ophthalmic nerve and the optic nerve, and a little bit of interesting trivia about each before we get started with the brainstem. Ophthalmic nerve, cranial nerve 1, has olfactory receptors which project directly through the cribriform plate to the olfactory bulb. This projects directly to the olfactory cortex in the basoorbital and mesotemporal lobes without a nuclei. The trivia point for the ophthalmic nerve, for the olfactory nerve, is that it's the only sensory input to the cortex that does not have a relay that runs through the thalamus. So that's the interesting fact about the olfactory nerve. The optic nerve, the other non-brainstem cranial nerve, projects through the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is the major nucleus of the second cranial nerve. Trivia point around the cranial nerve 2 is it's the only cranial nerve that is embryonically derived from the central nervous system. So therefore, you see optic neuritis clinically in multiple sclerosis, which is a central demyelinating process, but not in Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a peripheral process. So again, cranial nerves 1 and 2 are just a little bit different. Moving on to our trick to learn the location of the nuclei in the brainstem, we start with a little bit of a brainstem cartoon. So if you were to draw a grid like this one, with dividing the brainstem into 3 portions, midbrain, pons, and medulla. The center line here in the middle represents the midline. And then the other thing I'd like to do in this cartoon is to divide this into a medial and lateral component. So we're essentially dividing the brainstem up into 6 pieces, midbrain, pons, and medulla, each of which has a medial and lateral portion. So our trick then in learning the location of the nuclei is to remember 2 rules. One, the rule of 5, which is actually the Roman numeral V, and the second, the rule of 12. Simply stated, the rule of 5 means that any cranial nerve that contains the Roman numeral 5 as part of its name is a pontine nucleus. Rule of 12, any cranial nerve which is 12 or a factor of 12 is midline rather than lateral. So let's look to see how that sort of plays itself out. If we count down starting from cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 3 does not have a Roman numeral 5 in it, and it is divisible into 12, so therefore it is not pontine, has to be midbrain, and it's going to go into the midline. Similarly, cranial nerve 4 will be midline because it is divisible into 12, but because it has a Roman numeral V in it, it's going to be in the pons, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. So there's cranial nerve 4. Cranial nerve 5 does not belong in the midline. It's a lateral nucleus. It's not divisible into 12, whereas cranial nerve 6 both has a Roman numeral V and is divisible by 12, so that goes in the pontine midline section. And you sort of see how this is working out. It's followed by cranial nerve 7, 8, and that's our last cranial nerve with a Roman numeral V. So we now move down to the medulla for 9, which doesn't go into 12. So 9 is going to be a lateral medullary nucleus, as is 10 and 11. And then finally, cranial nerve 12 brings us back over to the midline, because you can divide 12 into itself. So that's a very simple way of remembering the cranial nerve nuclei. Now I'll show you what it looks like in the actual anatomy. Again, I've drawn the grid lines here, just like we did in our cartoon, divided into medial and lateral. You can see the medial portion is much narrower than the lateral portion. And the nuclei are more or less essentially where I drew them in our cartoon diagram. I would point out 2 exceptions to the rule. First is cranial nerve 4. In cranial nerve 4, which per our rule would be in the pons because it has the Roman numeral V, actually tends to be at the the midbrain pontine junction. So technically it's probably just a little bit to the uppermost portion of the pons. And the second exception to remember is cranial nerve 5. The motor section of cranial nerve 5 is very clearly in the pons. However, the sensory nucleus is a very, very long nucleus that extends from the pons really essentially through the entire course of the medulla. It's a very broad nucleus. So the sensory portion of 5 is much broader. But with those 2 exceptions, the rule of 5 and the rule of 12 works pretty well. If you'd like to see the published reference on this, it's included on the screen. And again, in the second part of this presentation, we'll cover the longitudinal location, or the location of the longitudinal tracts. Thank you.